everyone. Just grooving to my new music. Hope you all enjoyed it. And how are you? My name is Marilyn Shannon, and this is the Breaking Free Show, and today is September 2nd. And first, before we get on with the show, I want to introduce Amnon, the man. How you doing?
I'm fine. How was your week?
My week is great. Every day is a week, actually. Or a month, or a year. Who knows? No, who really knows anyway? And you?
Just fine.
Yeah, everything's going good?
Everything is going just good. I bet you're real busy.
I am real busy. You know
why
I'm real
coming over?
Yes, it's a Jewish holiday this week, and I am having a lot of friends and family to my house Thursday night. So thank goodness my mother is here. She can help do some cooking. If not help, I do the shopping and cleaning, and she does the cooking. So, Mom, if you're listening, there you go. I said it, and I'm excited about having you cook. So anyway, it's a real exciting week, and I'm excited for today's show. The topic we're going to be talking about is near and dear to me, as well as to, I'm sure, many of you out there, and I'm delighted to have you here. This topic, I don't think you can talk enough about, and my guest is extraordinary because I watched him on TED Talk, and I thought, wow, he's like, honestly, the poster child to be able to talk about this, because if you listen to this man talk about consciousness, there is no way you can't understand it. There's no way you can't, unless you're blocked and don't want to. But if you want to understand this extraordinary concept of consciousness, which goes way beyond anything I could have imagined, and I love talking about it, you'll get it from him. And before we get started, I just want to read a little bit of a quote that is kind of fitting for today, being Labor Day, and welcoming my guest. And it goes like this. He who works with his hands is a laborer. He who works with his hands and his head is a craftsman. He who works with his hands and his head and his heart is an artist. St. Francis of Assisi. And I want to thank Chris for bringing that up right away, because we were looking for something that was really fitting for today. So my guest is John Searle. He's an American philosopher. He's a professor from Berkeley, and he has countless contributions to contemporary thinking about consciousness. And I can go on and on, language, artificial intelligence, all kinds of things. And sometimes I just want to just say, here's the mic and just go, because everything this man is going to want to say, you're going to want to absorb. So I would just say, sit back, relax, and just let it come. That's it. And with that, I want to welcome John Searle to our stage, to our audience. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure.
Should be a lot of fun.
It sure will be. So I guess the first question I want to ask you, which is a big question and maybe not so big, I don't know, is how you define consciousness.
Yeah. Well, consciousness is supposed to be really hard to define, but I think if we're talking about a common sense definition that just identifies what we're talking about, it's not at all hard to define consciousness. Consciousness consists of those states of feeling or sentience or awareness. They begin in the morning when you wake up from a dreamless sleep, and they go on all day until you fall asleep again or die or otherwise become unconscious. And on this definition, dreams are a form of consciousness. Now, the key thing, the distinguishing feature about consciousness is for any conscious state, there's something that it feels like to be in that state. Think of the difference between drinking a beer and doing your income tax, or for that matter, between drinking a beer and doing your television program. These are different states of consciousness, and that means there's a different sort of awareness that's involved in the cases. So I don't think it's hard to define it. It's just that a lot of people find the definition uncomfortable because it doesn't identify an objective phenomenon like force, mass, or gravitational attraction. All the same, it's real. It really exists. All of us are conscious.
So you've been talking about consciousness for many, 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 many years. How did that concept come to you?
Yeah. Well, oddly enough, when I first got into philosophy, there wasn't much interest in consciousness. We were all obsessed with language. And it occurred to me we ought to be seriously concerned about the role of consciousness in language and the role of language in shaping our consciousness. Now, until a couple of decades ago, it wasn't regarded as really respectable. to talk about consciousness in philosophy. And when I was at the beginning of a new discipline of cognitive science, I used to tell people we've got to start talking about consciousness as a problem in cognitive science. But people were suspicious. They thought it's not a suitable subject for science. It really belongs to theology or something like that. And it occurred to me, we have these two different traditions that think they're opposed to each other, but in fact, they're both making the same mistake. One tradition is the tradition of God, the soul, and immortality. And that says consciousness is not part of the ordinary physical, biological world. It is a spiritual phenomenon. It goes on in the soul, and the soul is not part of biology. It's created by God. Then there's another tradition that thinks it's opposed to that, and that's the tradition of scientific materialism. And that tradition says, well, consciousness, that's not part of the physical world. It's not part of the biological world. If it exists at all, it's not a suitable subject for scientific investigation, and it probably doesn't exist at all. So here are these two traditions that think they're opposed to each other, but both make the same mistake. They both say consciousness is not a part of the physical world. Now, if there's one message I want to get across this morning, or it's afternoon where you are, it is that consciousness is a biological phenomenon like digestion or photosynthesis. Now, that once we see it that way, it's a process going on in the brain caused by neuronal processes in the brain. Once we see it that way, then we have a handle for getting an understanding of it, for getting a grip on how it actually relates to our lives.
And you know what? That makes perfect sense. So it's a biological. It's biological.
Absolutely. All of our conscious states, as far as we know anything about how the world works, all of our conscious states, without exception, are caused by lower-level neuronal processes in the brain. They're caused by neuron firings. We think variable rates of neuron firings relative to different neuronal architectures. And the conscious states themselves go on in the brain. So we're talking about biology in a way that when we talk about digestion or growth, we're talking about biology. Now, the fact that we've been unable to see this for so long is a result of the fact that it's tied in with a religious tradition. It's made to seem, no, it can't be part of biology. It has to be part of an immortal soul, a spiritual entity that's somehow stuck onto the brain. And in fact, until fairly recently, most neurobiologists were reluctant to deal with the problem of consciousness. I had a hilarious conversation with neurobiologists at University of California, San Francisco. One particular guy is quite well known. He finally got exasperated with me, and he said, look, it's okay in my subject to be interested in consciousness, but you better get tenure first. You better have a job security, because most scientists didn't think it was a real scientific subject.
Right.
Now that is changing, and now I think you could probably get tenure by doing good research on consciousness. So it's becoming intellectually respectable, but it's a battle. A lot of people think, well, we shouldn't really take it seriously as a scientific phenomenon.
Right. Well, you certainly have not been on everybody's A list, from what I can tell. And then, so Chris has a question, and she says, what does Dr. Searle think of near-death experience where people think they are seeing God or the afterlife? What do you think of that?
Well, the problem with it is that the stuff that I have seen tends to be anecdotal. I mean, if we were going to take this seriously, we'd have to have a serious scientific study and get some major hospital or set of hospitals to do a serious examination of patients who claim to have near-death experiences. But the stuff that I have seen so far doesn't convince me. It's anecdotal accounts of remarkable experiences that people have had. Now, the mistake, and we always tend to make this mistake, is to suppose that either this is an authentic insight into the nature of supernatural reality, life after death, or we've got to believe that the patient is lying. And since the patient isn't lying, it's obviously many of these people are totally sincere, then it looks like you've got a proof of life after death or something like that. Now, that dichotomy is false. It can be both the case that a person is completely sincere, there's no charlatanry involved, and at the same time the case that you're not really talking about some supernatural phenomenon. So if I was going to do a serious study of this, I would want first to find out, have there been really serious scientific accounts rather than what one normally gets, which are effectively anecdotes.
So, with that being said, is there one consciousness, or are there multiple you have a consciousness and my consciousness, are they different?
Well, my consciousness is surely different from your consciousness, absolutely.
Right.
And this is a remarkable feature about consciousness. Not only does it have this qualitative character that I described earlier, but it's got clear boundaries. All of my conscious states come as part of a single unified conscious field, and all of your conscious states come as part of a single conscious field. And there isn't a sort of an overlap where, it isn't like adjoining mud puddles where mine might kind of join in with yours or something like that. No, it's entirely what's going on in my head and what's going on in your head. Now, there are interesting clinical cases where you get apparently split consciousness, where you get two centers of consciousness in one person. And these come from operations where they cut the corpus callosum. That's a body of tissue that holds the two halves of the brain together. And there are very severe epilepsy cases where the standard cures don't work, so they tried to cut the corpus callosum. And it does stop the epilepsy, but it produces some very peculiar symptoms. So, for example, you hold up a spoon in front of a guy so that the right side of his brain sees it, but the left side doesn't. And you ask him, what do you see? And with the left side of his brain where he has language, he says, I don't see anything. And then with his left hand, which is controlled by the right side of his brain, he reaches out and grabs the spoon. Now, the temptation is to think, well, there must be two centers of consciousness in the guy. And I think that is the natural way to interpret these experiments. These have gone on now for a long time. They started with Roger Sperry, and Mike Gazanik has done a lot of work on this. So the split brain cases are cases where it looks like you have two different consciousnesses going on in the same person. Normally they coalesce, but you can get cases where you separate one from another.
So if your consciousness is your consciousness and my consciousness is my consciousness, then what is it that you mean by, and maybe you didn't come up with this, but the title of your TED Talk is Our Shared Condition.
Yeah.
What is that? Talk about that.
Well, I didn't put that title on.
Okay.
That was by the TED people. I was just talking about consciousness. I think the reason, I don't mind the title, I think it's a pretty good title, and what that they're driving at is we all human beings are conscious. We don't all suffer from cancer or heart disease, but we're all conscious. And then the question arises, well, if this is such a distinctive feature of human beings, surely we ought to have a scientific theory of it. And I think that's right. A lot of people have said, well, it isn't really all that important. It's desperately important because it's the condition of anything having importance at all. Whatever you think is important, you think politics or art or literature or philosophy, if you think they're all important, as I do, you have to remember their importance won't come across to you if you're in a coma or a complete zombie. So the condition of anything being important is that you be conscious. Consciousness, in a sense, is number one in importance. Without it, you can't attach importance to anything.
Right. Or possibilities or anything.
Yeah,
You
right.
know, when I was reading some of your work, and it dawned on me, part of what I do is I'm a Superior Court mediator. And one of the things that I recognized a long time ago is that if I was mediating a case where we needed to have an interpreter, let's say that it was a Hispanic and English speaking, whatever, and we needed an interpreter. We needed an interpreter that was a mediator and also could interpret in Spanish, because you had to have you couldn't just say my word. You had to understand, because there's no translation for some words. You had to understand the nuances. You had to understand the meaning in the sentence, in the phrase, in the context of what I was saying in order to actually transmit the totalness of what it is.
No, that's absolutely right. And in fact, I guess it's now pretty much of an established phenomenon that languages don't just articulate a culture, they are bearers of a culture. And when I lived in England, as I did for many years, it took me quite a while before I overcame the fact that, as Oscar Wilde said, we're two countries separated by our common language, because there are different cultural assumptions built into American English that you don't find in British English. But and I think one of the interesting things is all the different varieties of Hispanic culture that are articulated in that are expressed in the Spanish language. So it's an important fact. I mean, we've known it for a long time, but the temptation is to forget it. That language does not just express our sensibility. It doesn't just express what we're feeling and thinking, but it partly embodies it. If you have a set of categories, they will enable you to cope, and those categories are linguistically contained. The famous French thinker La Rochefoucauld said, very few people would ever fall in love if they never read about it. Nowadays we'd have to add if they didn't see it on television and in the movies. But what he's getting at is that you don't just have an experience, but you have an experience that's shaped by language, that's shaped by your cultural experiences as articulated in language.
Okay, so that brings me to something I'm trying to figure out what I'm trying to say or how to say it. So that when you talk about consciousness, where does the heart enter into the head's concept of consciousness? Because as far as I know, you can't think a feeling, you have to experience it, and that's where the heart comes in. So
I think that's absolutely right, that we have a misconception that thought and rationality are, if they're healthy, are unemotional. But we know from all kinds of experiments that people who are totally unemotional can't reason. They can't behave rationally because rationality requires motivation. And motivation requires desire. And desire for human beings has its strongest form in the emotions. When you fall in love or have a tremendous ambition, these desires are expressions of emotion. So it's another mistake in our tradition, in our philosophical tradition, is to oppose emotion and rationality. And there are lots of forms of irrationality where the irrationality is motivated by strong emotional desires. But the thing that underlies that, the thing that we have to keep reminding ourselves of, is without the heart, the head doesn't function. That is, that's a metaphor, to put it literally, without some set of desires, of which the emotions are the strongest form of desires, you can't behave or think rationally.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's, I mean, when I'm listening to you and I'm reading some of, your stuff, and I'm thinking about all the things that people are saying, I'm dumbfounded by this concept and not being able to get this. It seems so simple.
Yeah. Well, we have several different philosophical traditions that are really sources of obstruction to intellectual and cultural and political advancement. One is resistance to treating consciousness as a natural biological phenomenon, and that I've told you is this repeated conflict between the tradition of God, the soul, and immortality, and scientific materialism on the other hand. And they're both wrong. They both make exactly the same mistake. They both reject the idea that consciousness is a natural biological phenomenon. But another tradition we have is a tradition which underplays the role of emotion in intellectual life, which makes it think that somehow or other, if emotion plays a role, then you're sacrificing your intelligence. And I want to say that's sometimes the case. Often people do behave stupidly because they're emotional. And there are other mistakes like this in our intellectual tradition. And one is the idea that, well, our perceptual apparatus never gives us conscious access to the real world. They're always locked inside the prison of our own private experiences. So those are three standard mistakes, and I've spent much of my life trying to overcome them, but in any case, I'm making some progress.
No, I think you're making great progress. I would think that if you are not balanced, then there is no consciousness. And with balance comes a balance in emotion. I think if you're not conscious, that's when your emotions are out of whack. It's not the emotion that leads to consciousness.
Well, emotion doesn't lead to consciousness, but consciousness is shaped by and colored by the emotional state that
Right,
you're
right,
in.
right.
And part of the problem is that people can be in emotional states where they lose any sense of rational freedom, where they just act in a rage or in the grip of some overwhelming conscious feeling. And clearly there are cases like that where people give up rational free will because they're in the grip of some overpowering emotion. But for normal pathological people, those are rare experiences. I mean, sometimes you get in a rage, and I usually feel ashamed of it afterwards. But in any case, there are cases like that where where our emotion overwhelms our rational thought processes.
So we have a question here, and let me see where it is, about what you think is, let's see, about sociopaths. Let me see if I can find it again. Let me look for it. Here. Can you ask John why someone is a psychopath or a sociopath?
You mean why?
Yep.
Well, if I knew the answer to
How
that,
or why?
I'd be publishing books about it. But it's clear that we have a definition of sanity which sets boundaries around what we regard as permissible or acceptable in society. Now, there was a period when several people, Lang and Zaz and various other people, said, well, really, these are all politically motivated. It's just a way of enforcing conformity that we call some people crazy or sociopaths or psychopaths. I don't think that's right. I think if you've got an 8-year-old girl who's trying to gouge her own eye out or bite her thumb off, that really is something you have to deal with. Now, clearly, we do set boundaries as what is socially unacceptable by identifying something as pathological. It's worth remembering that it wasn't so long ago that people thought of homosexuality as a kind of pathology, as a kind of psychopathology. Now that now seems silly to us, but there at any given time, people set boundaries bound their culture, bound their what they regard as acceptable, by defining the boundary in terms of what is crazy and what's not crazy, and the crazy is always on the other side. And we have to remember that a lot of this is culturally shaped, and a lot of it is arbitrary and unwarranted. However, that doesn't mean that there's no sense to the notion of psychopathologies. I think there are, and I gave you a couple of examples. I think we have to recognize that there are certain kinds of irrational behavior which we have to treat. We have to regard them as medical problems. So I'm sorry there isn't any simple answer to the question, but the complex answer is something like this. Societies define themselves by what they regard as crazy, and sometimes it's arbitrary. Sometimes something that they think is crazy isn't really crazy, and we have to overcome that. But it doesn't follow from that nothing's really crazy. Yes, there are forms of behavior that are really crazy. I debated some guys once at a conference in London, and it turned out one of the psychoanalysts present, we asked him, well, suppose one of your patients was trying to commit suicide. Wouldn't you interfere? Wouldn't you try to do something to prevent that? And the guy said, no, it's not his job. Now, I think that's a mistake. I think part of your responsibility as a therapist is to try, if you can, at least to keep your patient alive.
Right. You know, I have a question out on the chat on one of the sites that I posted this on earlier, and somebody was asking, can you have consciousness without a conscience? And I said, well, I had an answer, but I wanted to throw it out so you would be able to answer it for everybody Yeah.
It is an odd fact about the morphology that conscience and consciousness are very close to each other, both etymologically and phonologically, both in the pronunciation and in the history. But they are distinct notions. The notion of consciousness, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the notion of feeling or of awareness, subjectivity, where you have a sense of what it feels like to do something. Conscience has to do with a kind of monitoring of our behavior that we do by measuring our behavior against a set of standards that we have. And if something violates our conscience, we feel like, well, we shouldn't do it. But the questioner asked, is it possible to have consciousness without a conscience? Yes, it sure is. I know a lot of people who do that. Now, I'm sure I'm misunderstanding them, but I have to say I think some of the Republican representatives in the House of Congress, exhibit this. Though I don't want to get into the politics of this. I think it is possible to be completely conscious and make conscious decisions and not have a conscience about the consequence of your decision or the morality that motivates them.
See, I have a hard time seeing that. I have a hard time seeing that you can be conscious and not have a conscience.
Well, let me give you some examples that I think are clearer. We tend to talk as if only humans are conscious, but that's not really the case. We don't know how far down the phylogenetic scale of consciousness goes, but there's no question that my dog Tarsky is completely conscious. He's a great big Bernese mountain dog, and he is a wonderful doggy, but he does not give any sign of having a conscience. When he does something bad, I try to correct his behavior, but he doesn't show any sign of suffering conscience. And even if he did, even if I could finally convince myself that my doggy had both consciousness and a conscience, I don't think it goes down as far as grasshoppers or other sorts of simpler animals that can have consciousness, but do not have the sort of monitoring, self-regulating mechanism of the human conscience. It's a rather sophisticated phenomenon, the conscience, and little kids have to be taught it. And I don't think a newborn baby, though the newborn baby is clearly conscious, conscious of his desires, conscious of the satisfaction of the desires, but the newborn baby gives no sign so far of having a conscience.
It is so interesting. So how do you get conscious?
How do I get conscious?
How does somebody get, for me, getting conscious is, listening to me is a big deal.
Yeah.
That keeps me conscious.
Yeah.
So how do you tell people, would you suggest people get conscious?
Yeah. Well, okay, we're all conscious when we wake up in the morning, but I think what you're driving at are forms of awareness that go beyond just being awake. And there are various techniques that you follow. One, as you pointed out, was pay attention. And that, I have to tell you, that's hard to do. There's a class of people for whom it's almost impossible to pay attention. They're called professional philosophers, and I'm one of them. And the reason is they're usually thinking about what they're going to say next and not paying attention to what anybody else is saying. But getting a sensitivity to the environment, getting a sensitivity to other people, getting an awareness of the phenomena that are going on, that is an extremely sophisticated attitude to have. And it's one of the things we try to produce with education. Education, we give people education in not just in the sciences, but in literature, in the arts. They get a heightened awareness.
I need to interrupt you 1 second. Hold your, if you can hold that consciousness thought.
Yeah.
We have somebody on the phone. Hello?
Hi, Marilyn, Amnon. This is Debbie.
Hey, Debbie.
I'm calling in because I'm referring to that bit about consciousness, and you said, Marilyn, that you didn't think a person who could do an evil act basically could be conscious and living consciously. And I put on the chat that I understand what you're talking about. Just like earlier, Dr. Searle, you were answering the question about what is a sociopath or somebody who is going to be injuring themselves. If a person is cutting themselves or taking an overdose, there's something pathologically wrong with them. And in the same way, if you recognize all of humanity as a human consciousness, as we are all one, then if we harm another human being on the planet, then we are also harming ourselves, as we are all connected.
So do you have a specific question, or you just want John to...
Well, I think that there was a little dichotomy or something about your definition of being conscious, and Dr. Searle, the way that you said, yes, you can be conscious and do an unethical act, and it gets into politics, which is absolutely true.
Okay, so then do you have a question then? Or you just...
Well, he can just respond to...
Okay.
That
well, let me
okay,
just,
go ahead.
part of my question, and that is, well, what's the relationship between conscience and consciousness? If it's possible for conscious people to perform unethical acts and perform them knowingly. And the answer, I think, is it is definitely possible. Indeed, it's actual that people can perform evil acts quite conscious of what they're doing. Now, typically, they disguise the evil. They tell a story. They have a narrative. The Nazis had a ridiculous racial theory. The fanatic Muslims who destroyed the Twin Towers had a story about how they're really serving Allah, they're serving God. So people have various narratives that they tell themselves, but all sorts of monstrous behavior can be performed by people who are completely conscious and behaving evilly. And in extreme cases, they can know that they're behaving evilly. They can know that they're committing genocidal or criminal acts. Now, at one point, the questioner said, well, how could we ever take another human life? I think it quite often arises that certain people are so evil that it's better off to have the death penalty for such people. I don't regard the loss of Hitler's life, or for that matter, Osama bin Laden's, as somehow or other a loss to humanity that they died. I think the world is better off with them gone. So I don't think, well, there are a whole lot of points here we're making. One is, it's certainly possible for conscious agents to behave badly. Typically, they tell a narrative to try to justify themselves. But there are cases where some people are so evil that they have to be prevented from what they're doing, and in some cases, I think it's justifiable to take their lives.
So, Debbie, so we're assuming that consciousness is a good thing. Like I used to think that when you're conscious, you're connected. You're evolved, you're alive, you're awake. But I think if I understand you, John, correctly, and maybe I don't, because this is so, a lot to grab, that there's level of consciousness or levels of clarity that being in my consciousness can seem okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, is consciousness a good thing? The answer is it's such a good thing that it's a condition of ever being anything that's good. That is, as I mentioned earlier, if you value anything, it's no good if you're a total zombie or in a coma. So there's a sense in which consciousness is the condition of possibility of anything being good. However, by the other side of that coin is that most things that are bad depend on consciousness as well. So you have you've got consciousness as the precondition of behaving well or badly. If you're not conscious, you can't do either of those. But once you are conscious, then you have possibilities opening up to you that you wouldn't have otherwise.
Debbie, go ahead.
It's really, really fascinating. So, consciousness, where does it fall in the realm of acknowledging the definition of right and wrong? Depends where does that fall in the hierarchy of consciousness? You're saying you can be conscious and make a wrong choice. And everybody does it on a daily basis. I consciously know that I eat something wrong or don't do whatever I'm supposed to do, and we're consciously aware of the fact that we're doing something wrong. Is that part of that equation?
Yes. The point I'm trying to make is something like this. The whole idea of right and wrong requires conscious agents who are able to formulate and implement ideas of morality and immorality. It's rather sophisticated. Lower animals don't have this awareness. The lower animal does not think, this is the right thing for me to be doing, or this is the wrong thing for me to be doing. So it doesn't come automatically with consciousness. But once you have the kind of reflective consciousness that human beings have, then you have the possibility of moral judgments, moral decisions, as well as all kinds of other judgments, such as aesthetics and political judgments. So that a condition of judging in these realms requires consciousness, but consciousness isn't sufficient. You've got to have more than just consciousness in order that you can make moral decisions, or for that matter, political or aesthetic decisions.
So it's dependent upon community then?
Well, our education depends on community, but often, I mean, you acquire your values from your community, but often you find yourself making decisions that run against the community, that run. You can't get out of your responsibility by saying, "Well, I was just going along with my community," because often communities make mistaken or even evil decisions, and you have to. Yeah, you have to make your own judgment based on your own intellectual resources. Those resources are socially shaped and socially created, but you can't get off the hook by saying, well, I was just going along with the crowd and it's my crowd and I have to go along with them.
Okay, well, I'm going to just say one more thing and then I'm going to hang up.
Okay, hold on, Debbie, 1 second. Hold on 1 second. Just hold your thought just a second. Somebody else is on the line, right? Hello?
Yeah, hi.
Okay, hold on. Please hold on. Let's let Debbie finish her thought, and then I'm going to come right to you, okay?
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great. Debbie, go ahead.
Okay, after the last piece that he said, I feel as if there is a piece of the soul. The soul is speaking through this consciousness. And maybe he can, maybe you can entertain that idea. And I'm going to hang up and listen on the line, okay?
Okay. Thanks, Deb.
Okay,
bye.
thanks a lot. I used to think that the soul was a kind of harmless metaphor, but I don't think that. I think it really is a pernicious idea. The idea is that our consciousness is not a property of our brain. No, God attaches the soul somehow, we don't know how, but attaches the soul to the body, and then after the body dies, the soul goes on and has a life of its own. I now think that's a pernicious view. It isn't. It's false, and indeed I think it's probably incoherent because nobody's ever been able to make sense about how the soul and the body interact with each other. But I think it is a pernicious view because it enables people to neglect the actual facts of human existence and development, the actual conditions of their brains, the actual things that may shape their consciousness. If you think that the soul is something apart from the body, something not a part of our ordinary biological life, then you'll never get a real grip on how human beings can flourish.
Okay. All right. Hold on. Hello. Hold on 1 second, John. Hello. Who's on the line?
Hi, this is Andrea.
Hey, Andrea. Andrea.
Yeah, how are you?
I'm good. And you?
I'm good, thanks. And I have a
Good.
question for Dr. Searle.
Okay.
Well, I had a question in the beginning of the interview. You talked about how consciousness was much like other biological processes. And I was wondering if that, does that mean then that, or I guess I should just ask, do we have control over our consciousness? Or is it much like many other bodily processes that just automatically do what they do?
No, that's a very deep question, and it raises questions about free will. The short answer is that many aspects of our consciousness, we do have control over them. So I can decide that I'm going to work on my income tax tonight instead of watching television, or I can decide I'm going to drink or not drink. There are all sorts of ways in which my consciousness is controllable by my own rational thought processes. There's some things that I can't control. I suddenly feel a terrible pain in my stomach. Now, I might prevent that from happening in the future, but that particular experience wasn't brought on by any conscious decision on my part. It's just something that happened to me. But the question, as I'm sure you must be aware, raises very deep questions about free will. And we have free will. We have the problem of free will. We have this problem in both philosophy and ordinary life precisely because we have a certain type of consciousness. We have the consciousness of making decisions where we have a sense of alternative possibilities open. Yes, I voted for this guy in the election, but I could have voted for that guy. And these are cases where it's up to me, or we think it's up to me, which way I go. Now, it might turn out, maybe psychology and neurobiology will eventually prove that it's an illusion, that free will is an illusion, that we really don't have free will. But if so, it's a very peculiar illusion. It is not one you can shake off. See, if you think colors are illusion, you can live your life on the assumption that you don't actually see anything red. That's just a systematic illusion. But if you become convinced that you don't have free will, you can't get out of the decision-making situation. I mean, take a trivial case. You're in a restaurant, and they say you got a choice between, let's say, the veal and the pork, you can't say, well, look, I'll just wait and see what happens because I'm a determinist. You see, even if you say that, the refusal to exercise free will is only intelligible to you if you take it as an exercise of your free will. That is, if you consciously decide not to exercise free will, that is itself only intelligible as an exercise of free will. So free will is an odd phenomenon in our life because it might turn out that we will get an understanding of brain processes that will convince us that it's an illusion. But if so, we can't act on that conviction. When we make up our minds to do something, we have to have we have to act as if they were genuine alternative courses of action open to us, as if we genuinely had a free choice. So I think the question is a deeper question than you may have been aware of, or perhaps you were aware of it, because it raises very serious questions about the freedom of the will. And I don't have a quick solution to the problem of free will. I think we need to know a whole lot more about how the brain works before we're confident that we know the answer to that question. But in any case, there's no question that there's a very tight connection between the problem of consciousness and the problem of free will, because the problem of free will only arises because we have a certain type of consciousness. We have a consciousness of rational decision making where we make up our minds to do one thing and we have a sense, well, we could have done something else.
Thank you, Dr. Cyril.
Andrea, thank you so much. That was great. Thanks for calling in.
Thanks, Marilyn.
Good
Bye.
to hear from you. And those of you out there, you are more than welcome to call in as well, 919-518-9773, or you can Skype with us. I know we have several friends that are in different parts of the world, and you can come in on computers, that's plural, the number 2, K, voice. And we'd love to hear from you as well, because I am sure that there are some things that maybe you thought you knew, but you know, now that, John is speaking to us, maybe there's some things that you agree with, things you don't agree with. Maybe you want to make a point. Call in and share it with us, because all points are good, and we love to have you do that. So I want to get back to this thing about the soul, because that's got me a little bit caca here. Can you go back into that a little bit, because there's some things about that I'm not sure about.
Yeah. There is a perfectly harmless metaphorical use of the word soul, where it means something like the mind or the self. Honey, I love you with all my soul, I think is a perfectly legitimate locution. The problem is that people, in addition to that, have a tradition whereby there is a certain specific claim being made. And the claim is consciousness is not a biological phenomenon. No, it couldn't possibly be created by the brain. It's created by God when he creates the soul. And he takes the soul that he has created and attaches it to our body. And then eventually when we die, the soul will leave the body, because the body is now dead. But the soul will then go on and have an immortal life of its own. Now, this is a very comforting thought to an awful lot of people, and I wouldn't want to take the comfort away from them. There is not the slightest reason to suppose that story is true. And indeed, in fact, if we know anything about how the world works, your consciousness is dependent on your brain processes. In one way, my message is depressing, because what I'm saying is, when your brain is destroyed, your consciousness goes with it. Your consciousness doesn't get squirted out of your brain and go off and have a life of its own. It's entirely dependent on brain processes. Now, there are times when I wish that was wrong, when I think, well, it'd be nice if 100 years from now we could all get together in heaven, or maybe the other place, and have this conversation and see how wrong I was to think that we did not have a soul that survived the destruction of the body. But as far as we know anything about how the world works now, your consciousness depends on being alive and having brain processing. This, incidentally, is why those near-death experiences are interesting to us, and why it would be nice if there was a serious scientific study of those cases. So the tradition, I'm militating against two traditions. One is the tradition of God, the soul, and immortality, that says consciousness is not a part of our ordinary biological life. It's created by God when he creates the soul and attaches it to the body. The other tradition is just as bad as the tradition of scientific materialism that says consciousness is not a part of our ordinary biological life. It probably doesn't exist at all, But if it does exist, it's certainly not a suitable subject for scientific investigation. I am fighting against both of those traditions.
And so who stands with you? Who's on your side? When you say you're fighting those, who's on your side?
Well, okay, there are a number of philosophers that I respect enormously that I think would agree with most of what I've said. Right there in New York is a very good friend of mine, Tom Nagel, who's an excellent philosopher, teaches at NYU. And I think Tom would have the same attitude I have so far. Now, he thinks, though, there's something, he thinks something I don't think, and that is he thinks we can't possibly explain consciousness scientifically with our existing scientific apparatus. It's just too, it's too extraordinary. I disagree with him about that. I think we are now working on this as a scientific neurobiological problem, and just as we have figured out a lot of things about the nature of life and the nature of heredity, so I think we ought to be able to figure out the nature of consciousness. So that's one guy who's on my side. I'm just looking at this. Looking at the New York. I think Ned Block, who also teaches in New York, he would have similar views to mine about these issues. So I'm not alone in the world. There are people on my side, but I have to tell you that the prevailing intellectual atmosphere in the sciences is against the view that I have been arguing for. It's typically either a form of behaviorism, well, really there isn't anything to consciousness, it's just behavior, or in recent years, computationalism. Consciousness does exist on these people's view, but it's really something else. It's a computer program running in the brain. So if you got any computer with the right program, that would be a conscious computer. Now, I think that's obviously mistaken because the syntactical features of the program, where you go from zeros and ones very rapidly, that's not enough by itself to either constitute or generate these feelings of sentience or awareness, these subjective feelings that are the essence of consciousness. So there's a tradition that I'm fighting against, and I'm more worried about fighting against that tradition than I am in finding allies, but I do have some allies. There are people out there who share with me the idea that consciousness is a real phenomenon. You can't get rid of it by pretending it doesn't exist or by pretending that it's really something else.
Hey, Marilyn.
Oops, we have a caller.
Okay.
Hold on. Sorry, John. Hello.
That's okay.
Hey, Marilyn, it's Michael.
Hey, Michael. How you doing?
I'm all right. You really want me on this
Sure.
conversation?
Come on. What you got to say? Oh, Mike.
But you need to turn down the volume on the computer, Michael.
Okay, hold on. How's that?
So far, so good.
Hold on. I'm turned way down. I don't think I
Okay.
can hear what damn word you're saying.
Okay. Can you hear me?
I can hear you great.
Okay. So what did you want to add?
Well, I'm going back to the soul controversy that came up, where I've read on the text issues that it's about energy, it's about does it exist, is God a player in the game, and I think he is, and I think we have to understand that the soul is two parts. It's the yin part, it's the yang part. And when we're born, we get the yin. And then it's always connected to the yang, which gives us a complete connection without compromise to God. So our consciousness is dedicated to this communication through chakras, through earth and heavens, and it just becomes a very viable, if not unexplainable, kind of method of consciousness.
Okay, so can you narrow that down to do you have a particular question?
I don't necessarily have a particular question.
Okay.
I wanted to address the issue
soul.
of
Okay, so
what does it mean.
Okay, so you're saying that there's the yin and the yang, and that there's an energy to it, right? Mike?
Yeah, that's exactly it, Marilyn. I wanted to express to people that when we're born, there's this thing called the Taiji pole that literally I can prove that people exist.
Okay.
And when I do that, we know that within the yin, aspect of the Taiji pole exists, our yin soul. Because when we have the conversation,
So Mike, let me.
we come into this world.
Okay. So what you're saying then is you're saying consciousness involves the yin and the yang. Is that right?
It does.
Okay.
It absolutely
okay.
does.
So John,
Uh-huh.
what do you say about that?
I don't even know what it
Okay,
means.
Okay.
I'll check it
okay.
out.
Yeah.
As far as I know, I don't know of any neurobiological research on either the yin or the yang, but good luck.
Okay.
Mike.
Yes,
Okay.
ma'am.
That was it, right? So thank you.
Yeah,
That was a
that's
good
it for
point.
me.
Okay. So okay, that's a good point. Thank you.
Oh, you're
Okay, so you're saying, John, when you talk about, you don't talk about energy when you're talking about consciousness.
Well, I do. Yes.
Okay.
I think as a biological phenomenon, there are energy transfers involved in consciousness, and in fact, the brain couldn't be producing consciousness if you did not have neuron firings and other energy transfers in the brain. But the energy I'm talking about is straightforward neurobiology. I'm talking about neuron firings at synapses, which are the neuron firings are a matter of a transmission across the synaptic cleft, and the summation of information in the soma of each neuron. So there are lots of energies going on, and in fact, the remarkable thing about consciousness is the way it locks into our whole system of energy. So, for example, if I perform a simple action like raising my arm, well, there's a conscious decision making that causes my arm to go up. But anything that caused my arm to go up has to have a certain neurobiological realization. In this particular case, there's a specific neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, and that acetylcholine has to be excreted. It has to be transmitted across the synaptic cleft of the axon end plates. Now, that's a straightforward energy transfer involving electrical to chemical to electrical energy. And without that, the conscious brain doesn't work. So we're talking, when I say consciousness is a biological phenomenon, I mean it's a matter of energy transfer. But the energy transfer is straightforward chemical, biological. There's nothing mystical or mysterious about it. We don't know the details, but we've now isolated a whole lot of neurotransmitters that are specific to certain kinds of cognitive and mental and physical operations. The universe is a set of energy systems down to the ground. And when I say conscious of biological phenomenon, I mean we have to study it in the way that we study other energy transfers in biology.
Okay, somebody's asking us where you have received your training in neurology and brain science.
Yeah, what I did was I went and bought the standard undergraduate textbooks. If you want to learn a subject, go to your university bookstore and buy the freshman textbook, because anything that the freshman can understand, you will be able to understand. And I went and bought the standard textbooks, and including these $60, $100 jobs, and I sat down and read a whole bunch of them, and it was very revealing. The single most revealing thing about it is I realized these guys don't understand a hell of a lot about how the brain works. So they can tell you a lot about the microanatomy and about the physiology and about the number of carbon rings in serotonin, and that gets to be quite fascinating. But the questions I want to answer is, why are we conscious? How exactly are memories laid down? What exactly is the neurobiological base of motivation? What's the neurobiology of rationality? We don't know the answers to those questions. We're learning a whole lot. We know why cocaine affects your brain the way it does. We're starting to understand why alcohol makes you drunk. So we're not completely ignorant, but progress has been very slow. The brain is a very complicated mechanism. Anyway, I appreciate the question, because I'm entirely self-educated on the question of the brain. Occasionally I go and argue with my friends who are neurobiologists who've actually studied this stuff. But what I know, I get out of reading the standard textbooks. And by the way, I recommend that for any subject. Any subject you want to learn, go buy the freshman textbook.
Yeah, some of the kids' books are the best. I guess there's so much about this. We can go on and on and on. But I guess I still believe in the energy around us. I still believe that that's part of my consciousness. I still believe, and I value what you're saying, but I still believe that my consciousness, the higher my consciousness is, the more aware I am, is because of the energy around me, and maybe my brain does process it and does make me more conscious, but it's pulling it in. I mean, it's got to come from somewhere. And I believe that the energy around me and how my heart interacts with that energy, then my head processes it, and then I get more conscious as a human.
And what would you lose if you said, and in fact, all of that energy is an expression of the basic energy structure of the world. It's all a matter of gravity, electromagnetism, weak and strong nuclear forces, and how all of that is manifest in the operation of the brain and the rest of the biology. That is, I don't think I agree with you that of course it's all energy transfer that we're talking about here. That's how consciousness works. But I don't think anything is added by saying, well, there must be some extra kind of energy, a kind of energy unknown to physics and other natural sciences. Why? Why isn't that? The energy that we're familiar with, the kind of energy that's going on in the brain when I'm busy thinking about a mathematical problem or trying to solve a philosophical problem, why isn't that enough? Because that seems to me all we've got.
Yeah. And then I guess then you have that conversation of quantum physics, right?
Right. Well,
which is a huge. Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's a scandal that the physicists can't explain this to us in a way that's fully intelligible. The famous physicist, one of the top guys in the whole field, Feynman, said, well, don't worry about what quantum mechanics means, just do the equations. Well, that's not good enough for me as a philosopher. I want to know what it all means. Right. And I'm probably not a good enough mathematician to do the equations, but I regard this as one of the great challenges in contemporary intellectual life, is to make quantum mechanics intelligible to us, is to make it fit it in with what we know about how the rest of the world works anyway. And it's no good saying, well, quantum mechanics only deals with the tiny itty-bitty stuff at the subatomic level, because, of course, quantum phenomena go all the way up. The whole universe is has quantum indeterminacy, and I'd like to have a better understanding of that. But I'm not the guy that will produce that. That will have to be produced by professional physicists.
Well, it's interesting. Anyway, I know that we're almost out of this time, and it's been like, I feel like I'm on the stock market floor. There's all kinds of stuff going on in the chat, and everything is just heightened. So anyway, I want to thank you so much for bringing this out, talking to us in the way that you have. And, I guess one of the things Chris says is you believe it's already all in us already, just a process, and it's already there. All the consciousness is there.
The consciousness is there. But every time we open our eyes or our ears or hear anything, we're getting effects from the outside world on our consciousness. And, of course, I welcome that. And, indeed, whenever we do anything, our consciousness is acting on the rest of the world. Perfect.
Well, so are you selling any books these days, or do you have a website that you want anybody to go to?
Yeah, oh, sure. If you go on my website, you can find a whole lot of books I've written. I wrote a couple that are sort of relevant to this. One is called The Mystery of Consciousness. And there I actually review a whole lot of current research on consciousness. And another book is called The Rediscovery of the Mind. I think we got to rediscover the mind, because there was a period in cognitive science and philosophy and psychology when people just neglected the mind. They forgot all about it. So look at the rediscovery of the mind and the mystery of consciousness. And then I wrote a little book which is used in university courses. It's called Mind, A Brief Introduction. So those are 3 books by me if anybody's interested in this.
Perfect. Thank you. And so I want to just invite you all to join our Facebook page, The Breaking Free Show, so you can keep up with all of our upcoming shows. In fact, next week we're doing something very interesting on Sunday and Monday. We're having a doubleheader with Carrie from our channel here. Carrie, I'm going to be on her show Sunday night, and she's going to be on my show on Monday afternoon. It's going to be a great doubleheader with our medium and me. And then Monday morning at 11 to 12, Debbie Bruck does her Health In show. Sunday, Amnon's show is on at 9 o'clock with his hosts, and it's all about computers 2K Now. And then Julie's Reawaken Your Brilliance. Tune in to all of we have thousands of listeners, so please tune in. And if I can be of any service, coaching, please let me know. And with that, I think it's a wrap. Thank you all so much for being here. Take care and have a marvelous day. And John, thank you so much once again.
Thank you for having me. It was just great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
All right.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. Our weekly lineup of call-in programs includes Computers 2K Now with Amnon Nissan, Sundays, 9 a.m. till noon. Carrie's Psychic Cafe with Carrie Silkowski, Sundays, 8 till 9 p.m. Health In with Debbie Bruck, Mondays, 11 a.m. till noon. Breaking Free with Marilyn Shannon, Mondays, 1 till 2 p.m. Lessons of Vietnam with NCVVI members, the second and fourth Wednesday of each month from 7:30 till 8:30 p.m. Reawaken Your Brilliance with Julie Seibert, Wednesdays, 9 till 10 p.m. And if you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it at www.nissancommunications.com. Sponsored by ThatVidBlasterGuy.com, CarolinaApparel.com, and DeltaForce.net.